Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are back for the LCK Week 6 overview, analysis, and power rankings video. LCK is one of my favorite days of the week to do here every Tuesday. I hope you guys are excited as well. A lot of really good games this week. We're really starting to learn a lot more about these teams. Remember, after this week, there are only 3 weeks of the regular season remaining here in the LCK. We're getting close to the playoffs. It's really heating up very, very quickly. So a lot of these games really starting to become important as for seeding when we get into that playoff race. But let's just jump into it. I don't want to waste you guys' time too much, of course. Before we start the video, very, very quickly, let me know down in the comment section below what you guys thought of Week 6 here in the LCK. What teams impressed you? What teams did not? What players are looking good? What players aren't looking good? We're getting to playoff time, so this kind of stuff, like who's in form, it really does matter now more than ever. So let me know what you guys' thoughts and opinions are on all of that stuff down below. But with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into the action. If you are new here, what we do is we go through all 5 days of LCK action across the week, talking about all 10 series, talking about who I think did well, who I think did not do well. We go over each individual player performance, player of the series, dud of the series, and then at the end, power rankings, player of the week, dud of the week. You guys know by now, we're 6 weeks into this, and you know, I do every single region. You guys are probably familiar with the format by now, so let's not waste too much time. Let's go ahead and jump right into our Day 1 action. And we kicked off Day 1 and Week 6 with a series between Nongshim, RedForce, and Gen.G. And Gen.G is able to take this 2-0, and that's how it should be. They are the better team, and they came out here and proved it. Nongshim, you know, to their credit, a team that continuously shows fight in a lot of these games, mostly because they do have some talented players. Unfortunately, they just don't have the consistency to be able to put it all together, to be able to generate a lead against good teams like Gen.G, and that was definitely showcased in this series. My player of the series on the side of Gen.G is going to go to Chovy. He has just been so much better as of recently. Earlier on in the season, it was very much the Pez show in terms of what this Gen.G team was doing. Peanut was investing a lot into that bot lane, was very much trying to gain early leads in the jungle, playing really aggressive towards the beginning of the year so that he could make sure that he could invest a lot into that bottom lane, make sure that he could go down there and make sure that Pez and Delight were comfortable because they are the new additions to this team. Obviously, Topside returning from last year, Pez being a rookie, Delight coming in from a bottom team in Bro. You really wanted to make sure those two could get on the right page to start the year, and they did. Pez was really, really good with a lot of those resources, but we all know where the resources should be going on this Gen.G team, and that's to their superstar, one of the best players in the world in the mid lane, in Chovy, and he's finally starting to get to play some of these carries a bit more often. He got to play the Sylas in Game 1, not necessarily what I would consider a carry pick, still something that I think is more, I don't know, facilitative, at least in effort, but he played it like a carry. Like, Chovy is too good to be given Sylas and not be able to just destroy the game. He was so much better than Fiesta in game number 1 that it was actually disgusting. That mid gap was huge on the side of Gen.G, and it really caused that game to spiral out of control incredibly quickly. And then game 2, while it wasn't exactly Chovy by himself popping off, he still had a phenomenal game on the Kassadin. Fiesta was a little bit better, but he hit that power spike on the Kassadin, and by the time we got to the late game team fights, the game was basically over. I know some people are going to look at that game too and be like, oh wow, maybe Gen.G's not actually a top team because they struggled a bit against Nongshim. Remember, this is the Nongshim team that took games off of some of the best teams in the entire league. Teams like T1, teams like Dplus KIA, teams like KT Rolster, a lot of the teams around them. Nongshim has been able to take games off of teams this year, or at least put up relatively good performances against them, but for Gen.G to be able to win this 2-0 and to honestly just look like the better team throughout both games, I think is a very good sign. I saw a lot of doom and gloom surrounding Gen.G after the series. I personally just don't understand that really at all. I saw a lot of people criticizing Peanut's performance, and while he wasn't perfect, I think this is what you like about Peanut for the most part, is that he's going to go out and he's going to try to win you the game. Like, he's going to make these really aggressive plays. He's going to try to own the map macro-wise. He's going to try to shut the enemy jungler out. And sometimes that can be punished, especially if he oversteps what the rest of his team is able to cover. But for the most part, he was able to create a situation where Gen.G held the macro advantage all throughout every single bit of both of these games. And so I don't really understand why people are super hard on Peanut when it comes to that. I saw that a ton on Twitter and Reddit. I saw a lot of people criticizing Doran's game 1 performance, but I mean, look at game number 2 on the Jax. He obliterated Din Din in this game, and so a lot of good to take away for Gen.G. Chovy is my player of the series, but it's hard to not mention players like Doran, Peanut, Pez, Delight as really good contributors and as a team that generally speaking is very consistent. I know they didn't have the best of weeks last week and they weren't able to actually take down KT Rolster, which I think is a pretty big loss, but outside of that, they've only lost to T1 all year so far. They were able to beat Dplus, they were able to beat Liiv SANDBOX, all of these other teams that are kind of around them in the standings. This is a good Gen.G team, and they deserve to be mentioned in the top, at the very least, top 3 in the LCK right now. I can see how some people might be a little bit higher on some other teams, but Gen.G is very good, and I think they proved that in this series. As for Nongshim, they are exactly who we thought they were. They are the same team that they were last week, and the week before, and the week before. This is a team that can generate leads in some lanes. Vital was really good in this series. Oftentimes, it's been Fiesta being able to generate leads, or sometimes it's Din, sometimes it's Sylvie, but this bot lane was really good in this series. They were able to get pretty strong on the Zeri, but it's the macro that falls apart for Nongshim. It's the same story as it has been the entire year so far. Talented players, no macro, no experience, and that's just what you're going to get out of Nongshim. There are talented players on this team that I think could make a career in the LCK. Vital had a really good showing here. I think Peter has been much better over the past few weeks as well, but generally speaking, as a group, Nongshim just hasn't been very cohesive, and especially when you start getting into the mid game and the late game, especially against teams that have a player like Peanut, who has a really good idea of where he wants to be and what he wants to do in the mid game. It really highlights what Nongshim can't do in that part of the game. Fiesta's gonna get my dud of the series. He got obliterated in game number 1. He actually had a decent game number 2, I would say, on the Akali. Certainly not perfect. I would say he still was worse than Chovy, especially towards the back half of the game. But game number 1 was miserable from the Nongshim mid laner. He's had a lot of performances like this. Some that are really good, some that are really, really, really bad. And unfortunately, this was a really bad performance. Sylvie continues to disappoint, be kind of on this downward spiral. Din was really bad in the top lane, got completely blown out in game 2. It was really up to Vital and Peter to be able to win Nongshim this series and a game in this series, and unfortunately, they just were not able to do that. Nongshim is the team we think they are. In my opinion, they are the worst team in the LCK right now. That doesn't mean they can't grow. It doesn't mean that they don't have nice potential, but in terms of what they are offering in spring of 2023, Nongshim is probably the worst team in the LCK, and that was on display, in my opinion, in the series. As for Gen.G, they get a bad rap, and I don't really understand why. People love to hate this org. People love to hate Chovy because he's too passive, but he was awesome in the series. People love to hate Peanut because he's not the jungler that I guess people like to cheer, but whatever, man. Peanut's really good. There's really no denying that. Doran was really good in this series, especially on the Jackson game 2. Gen.G's just a powerhouse of a team. They are incredibly solid, and they're going to be a tough out for basically anybody in a best of 5. I really don't like a lot of teams in the LCK's chances against Gen.G in the best of 5, even if they're playing well. That's the kind of consistency that I think a team like Gen.G comes at you with, and honestly, I think they might even improve as the year goes on. Moving on now to our second series of day number 1, and it's a good one. It's a top of the table clash, or at least kind of a top of the table clash, certainly a standings defining clash between KT Rolster and Dplus KIA. A very interesting matchup. KT obviously been on an absolute roll as of recently. They have been looking dominant over a lot of really good teams here in the LCK, but Dplus on the opposite of that. They started off the year pretty strong, looking clearly like one of the top 2 teams in the region, but ever since then they have faltered. They have fallen a lot to some teams that they probably shouldn't have lost to, including this KT Rolster team. It's time for revenge, and DK gets it here as they win 2-0. They look really, really solid here. This is the KT Rolster that I think I was kind of waiting to see. The one that was going to go up against top competition and, you know, actually run into some problems in the early game, which they really hadn't been doing. Cuz was particularly bad in this series. We'll get to KT after. Let's get to what Dplus did well. First and foremost, player of the series for me is going to go to Canyon in the jungle. We finally got to see Canyon Italy in 2023. I understand that that champion is incredibly weak right now, because she is. She's incredibly weak right now, but Canyon pilots her at such a ridiculous level that it's almost impossible to say in any meta that Canyon should not be picking Italy. He's just too good at the champion to ever feel like it's the wrong choice to make, and he pulls it out here in game number 2, and he looks awesome doing it. Now, he had a good game 1 as well, doing a really good job, I would say, facilitating the rest of the team, but game 2 really felt like the one that was, like, close, I guess you could say, so Canyon being able to generate a large lead in the early game in particular for Dplus was massive. I think, they were up something like 5k gold, towards the back half of that game, even only up 3 kills, and a lot of that was just on the fact that Nidalee was dominating the jungle matchup. We'll get to Cuz in a bit, but he did not have a good series really at all, and a lot of that was due to Canyon and his pressure that he was able to exert on the entire map. The other player that you really want to shout out for Dplus, luckily for them here, is Showmaker in the mid lane. I think Showmaker's honestly been kind of meh over the course of the year so far. He's had some ups and some downs, but this series wasn't up for him. He was going up against maybe the best mid laner in the LCK so far in 2023 in BDD, and he looked better. He was just able to win a lot of the laning phases, especially in that game 1 as the Akali into Taliyah. Taliyah's going to want to shove and get out on the map to try and limit the damage that Akali can do, especially in the early game. If you can get the rest of your team ahead, especially this Lucian Nami in the bot lane, it's going to be a lot easier to deal with that Akali in the late game, but unfortunately for them, Akali is able to pick up some early kills, and from that point onwards, the game is basically over. Showmaker on a champion like Akali with gold is very difficult to deal with. He's gonna be in every fight. He's going to be an impact player, so overall, Canyon and Showmaker winning games for Dplus. What a big surprise. I mean, honestly, in 2023, that kind of is a surprise. Deft and Kellen have certainly been the strong point of this team, I would say, so far this year, but it's really good to see the jungle mid really stepping up, especially when we started to question them the most over the course of the year. Canyon was really good, but I really want to point out Kana in the top lane. We could talk about Cuz not having a very good series. Kana was also just roaming around that upper top side, making Cuz's life very difficult. I mean, obviously the solo kill in game 2 is hilarious. Watching Renekton solo kill a Wukong isn't a good sign, I would say, from the enemy jungler. But Kana, when this team is playing well, looks really good. I can't stress that enough. He's had some bad games over the course of this split, but when everything else is clicking, when this team has advantages, when he can play with that aggression that we know he likes to play with, this team can generally look very, very strong. Overall, I would say Dplus looked very, very good in this series. Definitely the dominant team. It's unfortunate, though, because it's at the expense of KT Rolster, who were finally starting to come into their own and really felt like they were kind of proving themselves at the top of the standings here. This was a win that I think they really needed to get in order for me to feel supreme confidence towards this team. They're still a solid team, but they kind of just got outplayed and outclassed in this series. Cuz is going to get my dud of the series. I know I've been talking about it a lot, but he just was really bad. It felt like there was no jungle pressure on the side of KT Rolster. You can blame it on the fact that BDD got shoved in super hard in game number 1 and had no pressure, that Keen wasn't nearly as good as Kana in this series, that Aiming and Lehens weren't able to carry to the level that they needed to, especially in that game number 1. But at the end of the day, you as a jungler need to know how to recoup losses and at least make the game bearable. You don't have to win every jungle matchup, especially if your lanes are getting pounded, but you have to at least be able to keep the game close. In game number 1, it just got out of hand way too quickly. And game number 2 was very similar. Canyon on the Nidalee was able to exert so much pressure over Cuz on the Wukong that basically from like minute 5, minute 6 onward in the game, DK just held all of the control and Cuz had absolutely none of it, and he couldn't do anything in the game or in the series. I'm not going to say that Cuz has been a weak link, because honestly, throughout this team's wins, he's honestly been pretty good, but Cuz is someone who has struggled with consistency in the past. Last year, I think, was definitely an example of that, where when games mattered the most, it really felt like Cuz shut off. Hopefully, that's not going to be the case in 2023. I still think BDD is pretty good, even if he did get a little bit outclassed in game 1. Aiming and Lehens are solid, but losing on Caitlyn Lux early on into the game, I get you're going into a Nidalee who has a ton of pressure, but not being able to generate a strong early lead there is definitely a little disappointing. Outside of that, I mean, KT didn't look really all that bad. It was just the loss of pressure and then an inability to recover from that point onwards. I would still say that KT looks like they should be one of the better teams in the LCK, one of the top 4-ish teams, but this is a really big win for Dplus, and that's really where I want to focus here, is that them getting back on track, I think, is a very good thing for the league. We've seen teams like SANDBOX, we've seen teams like KT Rolster, even Gen.G kind of usurp them, pass them as time has gone on in the spring split so far. If DK can get back on track, try to get back closer to that top 3, maybe even top 2 spot in the rankings, I think that's going to be good for everybody involved, because this team is really just too talented to be down at number 5 like they were last week. Moving on now to day number 2 of week number 6, and we kicked off day 2 with a matchup between Hanwha, Liiv Esports, and BRION, and Hanwha Life is able to take care of business. It's a 2-1 series win. I would have liked to see a little bit more out of this team. I think both teams, quite frankly, just didn't play all that well in this series, and I think that definitely shows in the fact that, game 1, 37 minutes, game 2, 43 minutes. These are not like long, drawn-out games because both teams are fighting back and forth. It's like nobody's trying to make any moves. We're all just sitting around doing nothing. I understand that we're kind of getting to the point in the year where it's, you know, we kind of understand how the game wants to be played. We understand the meta a bit more. Maybe we're starting to get a little bit more late game focused, but this is just too much. This is not good to watch. It's not good to project out into the future, but at least Hanwha Life was able to pick up the win here. That would have been pretty disastrous if they ended up losing a series to BRION, who quite frankly has been struggling a lot as of late. Let's talk about Hanwha Life though. Game 1 was theirs, Game 3 was theirs, and a lot of that was due to Zeka. Game 1 in particular was Zeka's show on this Kassadin. He was able to hit that power spike towards the back half of the game and really just take over. There was really no coming back for Bro at that point in the game. The Kassadin was much too strong and Zeka piloted it really, really well. Honestly, a really, really good performance coming out from him. He was also really good in Game 3 on the Akali. I could definitely say he wasn't the only one who was good. I think I would personally give my Game 3 MVP to Klid on the Lee Sin. He was really, really good on his signature Lee Sin pick. It's really good to see him be able to pull that back out, but the jungle mid duo, generally speaking for Hanwha Life, was pretty solid in this series, and that is a good sign because Klid has certainly been a little bit up and down. I will say, obviously, since he has stopped playing the Sejuani, all of a sudden he looks pretty good at an LCK level. Pretty shocking how that works. Another player who I think has also looked pretty good as of recently, especially compared to, you know, maybe what he was looking like at the beginning of the year, is Viper here in the bot lane. I think Life has gotten better. He's gotten more stable in the 2v2 early on in games, which has just opened up Viper to be able to start generating those leads again. That's what he does really well, is he wins the 2v2. He's really good with resources, but he's also really good at being able to generate his own leads and his own success in the bottom lane. And I think Klid, Zeka, Viper, they've been the driving points, I would say, for Hanwha Life over the past few weeks. It's really good to see these three step up because these are the three that are going to matter if Hanwha Life wants to make a push to be a top 4 team by the end of the year. But everybody else on the team was also fine. Kingin had some mostly good performances on Gnar. Not necessarily a great game 2, but nobody on Hanwha Life really played all that well in game number 2, maybe with the exception of Klid on the Nidalee, who had some good early game moments, but really, for the most part, this was Zeka dominating game number 1 and having a really strong game 3, especially damage-wise. It was Klid looking incredibly controlling on that Lee Sin in game 3, and it was Viper being incredibly consistent, I would say, over the course of the series as well. Those are the big standouts for Hanwha Life, in my opinion. And then you've got BRION on the other side. Not a great series for them, but you had some good performances, I would say, in isolation, especially in Game 2. Both Morgan and Henna have really stood out to me as players that have definitely improved over the course of the past year. I don't think either of them are really bad players by any stretch, but they're not necessarily superstars. Morgan has really good performances every once in a while. He'll have some series where he looks like a really good top laner. He'll also have some series where he doesn't look like a very good top laner, but against a player like Kingin, who is, you know, kind of vulnerable, I would say, to give away more of the aggression in an early laning phase, you know, Morgan was able to step up and kind of fight him for that. Henna had a really good series, though. I think Henna and Effort have actually been surprisingly good as a bot lane duo, and most specifically, Henna's mechanics late in games have been very impressive. I actually thought he had a really solid game number 2 on the Varus, even if the stat line doesn't show it, and I think that Ezreal game number 3 was very close to being relevant. Unfortunately, he just couldn't hit that breakpoint towards the back half of the game, but I think that Ezreal did have moments where he looked really, really solid. So Henna, honestly, kind of looking like the best player on BRION in 2023, which was definitely not on my bingo card, because Henna went into the year as someone who I was very concerned about, and especially pairing him up with Effort, who I think may have been the worst support in the LCK last year. Didn't have ridiculously high hopes for the spot lane, but they've kind of outdone those expectations, in my opinion. But when you're looking at the duds, it's the jungle mid duo. Just like they were positive on the side of Hanwha Life, they were very negative on the side of BRION. My dud of the series is going to go to Umti in the jungle. It just felt like in their losses, he was a little bit more of a problem, especially in that game 3 where he played the Vi into Klid's Lee Sin and just lost all pressure super early on in the game. But Karis was also not very good. I mean, we can talk about whatever that Rise flank was towards the back half of game number 3 when the casters are criticizing you. That's how you know it's a major problem. But Umti and Karis just haven't been superstars. Karis has had moments, I think, where he's looked really good, especially in laning phase. He's actually been relatively good at generating his own leads early in games, at least in previous series. It didn't happen in this one because Zeka is a very good laner, but Karis has been okay. Umti started off the season incredibly hot. He looked very good in their big week 1, week 2 performances, but now that we're in week 6, I think we've crashed back down to earth. Umti has really become one of the worst junglers in the league all over again, and that's kind of what we expected. It'll be interesting to see if he continues to play the whole year, or if they eventually do go to a player like Raptor, who is on the bench right now. I like Raptor a lot as a jungler. It'll be interesting to see if they end up going to that, but at least there are positives coming out for Bro. They're able to win a game against Hanwha. Not the most dominant team in the league, but at least you're able to pick up a game. This is a bro team who feels like they're free-falling right now. So picking up at least a game win over Hanwha was pretty good. Morgan and Henna in particular looking really solid and definitely looking like players that you can at least try and play through. Henna and Karis, if they can get on the same page, if they can have multiple games in a row where they're both playing well, I think Bro does have a chance of being able to win some games, but locking themselves in at number 7 does feel pretty strong for Bro right now. Not really a playoff team at all, but for Hanwha, at least you were able to win the series. It certainly wasn't the most convincing win of all time. I still think your main 3 are at least playing okay right now, which is a good sign because at the beginning of the year they were not. Klid and Viper were definitely not stepping up. But Klid and Viper have definitely stepped up to match Zeka's performances, which I think have been pretty consistent over the course of the year so far. If all 3 of those can continue to play at a high level, if Life can continue to get a little bit better in the early laning phase, not give over advantages nearly as much, and if Kingen can still be pretty solid as that weak side top laner, I do think Hanwha Life is a good team. How good? Probably not good enough to be top 4. It just doesn't feel like that's going to click for this team, at least right now or this year. But they do have the talent to end up making there. It's just performances like this that leave me questioning whether or not it's a team that actually will get there in the end. Moving on now to our second series of day number 2, and it's a good one. It's one I've actually been really interested to see for a little while now. 2 teams that I think are really interesting matchup-wise. We had the number 1 team in the LCK in T1 taking on Liiv SANDBOX, kind of the big surprises of the LCK split so far, and as expected, T1 are able to take the series 2-0, but Liiv SANDBOX at least put up a little bit of fight in these games. Definitely some strong points coming out from a couple of their players, others not so much. I would definitely say T1 kind of owned this series, and you can see that in the draft. Game 1 draft is relatively, strong for both sides, relatively standard, even though you're pulling out a 0 top on the side of Liiv SANDBOX. It's something that this team has flirted with in the past. T1 goes double top laner, Liiv SANDBOX goes double mid laner to kind of counter that as a joke, obviously. Gragas has been rising in popularity, I would say, as a mid lane pick over the past few weeks, most notably Mad Lions over in the LEC, picking a lot of Gragas mid for Niski, but a 0 top, something that we've seen quite a few teams pull out. This Liiv SANDBOX team, definitely no exception. Last year, obviously, with Dove in the top lane, was willing to bring out these kinds of things. It's interesting to see Bertle bring it out as well. Obviously, we've seen a lot of it in solo queues, definitely something to bring up there, but not necessarily working out in game number 1. And then game number 2 is just a full ego draft from T1. But honestly, it works. And it works really, really well. You have this incredibly hard pushing lane in the bot lane with the Jhin Caitlyn. You're going into Ezreal Ashe, the quad marksman bot. We've hit full potential when it comes to bot lane here. But Guma and Carry are just better, so they're able to play it out with an extreme advantage state. And then you're just looking for the massive wombo on the top side. You've got the Gragas, you've got the Lee Sin, and then you go for the Yasuo to try and punish it. You flex that Gragas into the mid lane. You see the Gnar come out from Bertle, and the traditional counter would be something probably like Aurelia that we've seen really commonly picked into Gnar, but Zeus wants to go for something a little bit flashy, something that combos really well with the rest of his team so far, so he goes for the Yasuo. We know he can play it at a high level. Both this and the Yone have been signature picks of Zeus, not only in solo queue, but in pro as well, so he pulls it out here, and they're really just able to dominate. Overall, T1 is just the better team, and it's by such a large margin that it's honestly hard to talk about. T1 is so much better than everyone that they are playing against right now. They look like the best team in the world, and they don't even look close. My player of the series is going to go to Owner. He's been awesome this year, maybe the best jungler in the LCK. I really haven't even said his name all that much on this channel. That should tell you just how good T1 has been. It's been all about Guma and Carry in the bot lane. Faker's had some incredible pop-off games. Zeus has struggled a bit at the start, but for the most part has been really, really good down the stretch, and Owner's just been hyper consistent. He really hasn't been given the tools to kind of drive the bus, if you will, but in this series, he definitely took over and was the flashy player, in my opinion. That Lee Sin game in particular in game 2 did die a few too many times, didn't necessarily get out nearly as much as maybe he wanted to, but for the most part, he just looks so ridiculously good on that champion, and he looks so ridiculously good when he's given the resources and the freedom to be able to play the kind of game that he wants to play. Big shout out to Zeus. He was also really, really good in this series. Obviously, the Yasuo game 2, really fun to watch, but the Gnar game 1 was honestly terrific. He abused Bertle on that Azir, who had a really, really bad game in game number 1. And honestly, he looked really, really good doing it. It's really impressive to see a top laner be able to come out and kind of force these off-meta picks to be a little bit less, volatile, a little bit less trade-oriented. I think that's really positive overall for T1, and I think Zeus did a really good job at that. Faker was really good, Guma and Keria were really solid. T1 just looks like a well-oiled machine that can't really be stopped right now. As for SANDBOX, not the worst loss in the world. This is a team that has been streaking a little bit, but Going into T1, certainly could be worse teams to lose to right now. Bertle's going to get my dud of the series. I actually think Bertle's been surprisingly really good so far in 2022. Or 2023. I shouldn't say surprisingly. Bertle is a good player, but to see him come in and legitimately be one of the best top laners in the LCK is a little bit of a shock to me, but goes for a little bit of crazy sauce here, pulls out the Azir top lane again. This is something we've seen pretty commonly in top-tier Korean solo queue. It's something that we've seen Zeus pull out. It's something we've seen Bertle pull out on his account. I believe Bertle was actually one-tricking it in the top lane for quite a bit, so certainly, you know, some experience on it, but for the most part, it's a pick that really has to win early. Obviously, Azir does scale into the late game, but you can be punished really hard if you're not able to win early. If that poke doesn't necessarily go through, the Azir is definitely punishable on that side. He goes for the Gnar because he thinks he's going into the Gragas in game 2. Just kidding, it's going mid lane, and now you have to play into Yasuo, which is a pretty terrible matchup for Gnar. Basically, anybody who can dash is a terrible matchup for Gnar, so not really a lot you can do in that scenario. Nobody else on the team really picked up the slack, I would say, even though I think Willer and Envy were relatively okay in this series. Envy in particular was able to do a lot of damage, especially on that Zeri in game number 1. He was really able to output a lot of damage in a lot of these team fights, but for the most part, you know, Willer lost jungle control pretty early on, even if he was able to capitalize on some owner mistakes. Closer was not nearly on the same level as Faker, which is disappointing because Closer often steps it up against his former organization, and Kale, not a particularly flashy series, wasn't able to really get the ball rolling, I would say, on that Ashe in game number 2. So overall for Liiv SANDBOX, a pretty solid standard performance, I would say, but the crazy Azir pick doesn't end up working out, and you're just not able to take down the hands diff that is T1. But for T1, you really are just the best team in the world right now. I find it really hard to see this as anything else. You are so far ahead of every other team that you're playing against in the LCK. It just seems like T1 is a lock right now for Spring Finals and for MSI, and I, for one, am really excited. This team is playing at the toppest of top levels. Keria might be MVP. Owner might be the best jungler. Zeus might be the best top. Faker might be the best mid. Guma might be the best ADC. They legit might have a team of the 5 best players at their position in the LCK right now, and that's just one of the scariest sentences I think I've said in a very long time. Moving on now to day number 3 of week number 6 here in the LCK. And we had an interesting day 3 matchup as we saw Gen.G taking on DRX. And of course, Gen.G does pick up the 2-0 series win. And honestly, it was still super clean. I know people want to hate this Gen.G team. It seems like consensus to try and poke holes, to try to find flaws in Gen.G. But at least through the past couple of series, I would say that they've honestly been pretty good and pretty consistent. I still think that obviously there are some flaws that keep this team out from being one of the best in the entire world. But when you have Peanut and when you have Chovy, you're going to be able to probably make this work, and both of them were really good this week. My player of the series on the side of Gen.G is going to go to Peanut in the jungle. I know a lot of people think that Peanut is overrated. A lot of people are going to take one series at Worlds against a good DRX team that we saw was good because they won Worlds, and they're going to say Peanut washed, Peanut can't play at a high level, worst jungler in the world. They're going to see 5 games, and they're going to base their entire player argument around those 5 games. But let's be honest, Peanut's been one of the best junglers in the world for over half a decade now. I think we've seen enough to be able to say that Peanut's pretty good at this whole League of Legends thing. Now, I get it. Sometimes he's not perfect. He does make mistakes, and he has some games where he's a little bit over-aggressive and can sometimes be punished for those decisions. It does seem like he's not always in the right frame of mind to make the best decisions in every single game, but you've got some of the best teammates in the world around you. You're going to be able to make this work. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I feel like him and Chovy in that jungle mid duo have really come together this year. Obviously, they were really good last year, but it felt like Chovy was more of that facilitative role because they wanted to play through bot lane so much in the late game. They really wanted to make sure that the mid game was incredibly focused on the bot side of the map because Ruler was the power point for that team. It feels like a lot of that has shifted in the past few weeks to the mid lane, and I guess you could say they have relearned how to play through mid lane, and I think that's incredibly strong. Chovy has been incredibly good over the past few weeks. I think you could very realistically give him player of the series. That Annie game in game number 1, Tibbers was tanking more damage than anybody in the entire game while also outputting a ridiculous amount. Annie is just such a strong champion when used at an optimal macro level right now that Chovy using it just felt unfair. But then Peanut game number 1 facilitating everything on the Sejuani, some great engages, damages, some great ultimates, and then the game 2 was spectacular. I mean, this was a jungle masterclass coming out for Peanut. He controlled and dominated Krako in this matchup. I know Krako's scoreline actually looks kind of good, but he still lost a lot of pressure in this series, and honestly, it was definitely Peanut favored and definitely Gen.G favored. I would say jungle mid is definitely where Gen.G got a majority of their leads, but you can't count out the fact that Pez and Delight were just better. I should note, DRX has a substitute in for this one. Dektum hurt his elbow. I'm not exactly sure doing what. I'm sure it's out there somewhere, but I don't remember what it is. So Pliata's in here for the bot lane, and he's fine. He's certainly not someone that I think is exceptional, but he'll be able to fill in. I think obviously DRX has plenty of other problems, but Pez and Delight were able to win bot lane. Doran was just the better top laner in the series. Rascal had some moments where he looked okay, but also certainly had his problems when it came to team fighting towards the back half of the game. Overall, everyone on Gen.G just seems to be clicking right now. Peanut and Chovy especially. I know people are waiting for the downfall of these two players. I just don't think it's going to happen. Peanut is still one of the best junglers in the world. Chovy is still one of the best mid laners in the world, and it feels like that's going to last for quite a long time. As for DRX on the other side, they're just not very good. You're 1-10 in your first 11 series. That's just about as bad as it could possibly get. Nobody on this team has been consistently good over the course of the year. There were moments where Rascal was looking solid earlier on in the season, but as we all know, it feels like he has completely fallen off a cliff. Krako has been, up and down. He had some moments in the middle of the season where he looked okay, but it feels like he is now playing the worst league he's played all year. Beryl has completely played awful. He's kind of reverted back to regular season summer Beryl from last year, and then obviously, you've got my dud of the series for this series here in Fate in the mid lane, who has also regressed so much. It just feels like everything that can go wrong for this DRX team is going wrong. Fate was completely outshined in the mid lane matchup. Chovy was so much better. It felt like Fate accomplished basically nothing this entire series. 1-7-2 doesn't even begin to tell the story of how useless Fate was in a lot of these fights. The damage coming out from Azir, non-existent. He's got to stopwatch at the beginning of every fight to stop himself from getting immediately blown up. And then as soon as he comes out of stopwatch, he gets immediately CC'd and immediately blown up. Very similar on the Victor in game 2. Not nearly as much perma CC, but the damage coming out from him and the positioning is just so poor that he doesn't really accomplish anything in the entire game. It just feels like every player who has stepped onto DRX in 2023 has disappointed and really not been able to kind of climb back up to any sort of respectable performance. It's incredibly disappointing. This is a team that has no business being nearly as bad as they are right now. But the truth is just that they are. Pliata was fine, I guess. He lost bot lane, but he was going up against Pez and Delight, who are certainly one of the more surprisingly good 2v2 bot lanes early on in the season. But overall, no one on this team played well this series. There's no some players were bad, but it's okay to point out one or two players that were playing all right. Everyone on DRX played poor in this series, and that's a testament to what DRX has been all year long, a disappointment. This team is 1-10, and they're not going to make playoffs in spring unless they make some major changes. I feel like summer just feels super out of the equation right now. Hopefully, whatever their issue is, whatever is going on internally at DRX can get figured out, because this team definitely does have talent, but right now, they are doing absolutely everything in their power to squander that talent, and that is clear for all to see. As for Gen.G, they look good. Maybe not one of the best teams in the world, like not one of the top 5 or anything like that, but they're definitely within the conversation, in my humble opinion, the clear number 2 team in the LCK right now. They have been the only consistent team, in my opinion, outside of T1. Everybody else has had their ups and downs or just have a general lack of talent compared to the upper echelon like Liiv SANDBOX. And so Gen.G to me feels very, very clear in that number 2 spot. Obviously, T1 feels leaps and bounds ahead of pretty much everybody in the LCK right now, but Gen.G is incredibly solid. They deserve a lot of the praise that they're getting, and they had another really good week here in week 6. Now moving on to our second series of day number 3 here, and it's kind of an interesting one, especially with how things have turned out in recent weeks. We had the Kwangdong Freecs taking on Dplus KIA, and DK does get the job done. They're able to take the series 2-0, a lot of 2-0 sweeps this week in the LCK. I think a lot of opponents that are relatively overmatched. We're definitely starting to see an upper layer in the LCK form, and it really does seem like Dplus is definitely part of that upper layer. DK looking really, really good in this one. You really needed this 2-0 week after what was a pretty disastrous week 5 and even week 4 where you really started to stumble. Feels like the last couple of weeks overall for DK have just not been all that good, but this week so far honestly has been great, and a lot of it has been the re-emergence of your superstar mid laner, Showmaker, who has obviously struggled a bit, I would say, over the course of 2023 so far. Wasn't exactly at his best in 2022 either. It really felt like he was kind of on the downswing, or at least that's kind of how I had been interpreting the last few performances that he had been giving over the last year or so, but this was a really good week, and this does give me confidence that, you know, Showmaker Playmaker is still inside there, especially with this Game 2 Kassadin game. Obviously, Game 1 was a little bit back and forth, and I should note, with DK actually winning both of these games, neither were early game wins for Damwon. You can look at the comps and kind of understand that a bit. I mean, Game 1 really should have gone the way of DK, if only just because Canyon on Lee Sin, he should be able to generate that early lead. Ezreal Ashe should definitely have push in the bot lane. Like, you should have pressure on the map here, but it was actually KDF who had like a 6-7k gold lead in this game and weren't able to close it out. It was just play after play after play, mostly arrows coming out from Kellen to really change the fate of what was going on in game number 1. And similar thing in game 2, not nearly as gigantic of a lead, I would say somewhere around 3 or 4k gold lead, which is still pretty big for KDF, but DK again, this time scaling up with the Kassadin, able to hit that late game power spike and able to end up winning this game. Both games probably could have been won by DK a little bit earlier, especially game 2, but you know, Canyon had to make some questionable decisions in the late game, and that ends up happening sometimes with really good players. Canyon especially can get himself into trouble by trying to make too many plays, especially on a champion like Sejuani, so definitely that might have been a little bit of a problem for DK in game 2, but for the most part, they were able to get it done. It's just really good to see some of these players stepping up. Showmaker getting player of the series, definitely deserving it after that fantastic Kassadin performance in game 2, but even the Akali game in game number 1 was really influential. He was definitely the best player in this series, but the other player that you have to shout out is Kellen in the support position. Anybody who follows the channel knows that I am incredibly high on Kellen as a player, and I have been for quite a long time. He was one of DK's best players last year. I would argue he was the second best player on Damwon last year behind Canyon, and I think that's carried over into 2023. I'm not saying he's the second best player, but he's certainly, you know, up there. He's certainly in the conversation, maybe for even being this team's most consistent player over the course of the year so far. A really good Ashe game in game 1. Really strong laning phase coming out from him on the Karma in game 2, although Taiyun and June did their best to try to push back on that with the Heimerdinger. It didn't exactly work. Bot lane was definitely the favored lane, I would say, for DK, but for the most part in the series, topside was actually going in KDF's favor until the mid game, where Showmaker was just able to take over, especially in that game number 2. They looked okay. I would like to see more early game leads, especially coming out from this bot lane. I think this bot lane is really the lane that I want to see be able to consistently generate their own leads in the 2v2. I'm not exactly sure that Showmaker or Kana should be kind of given that responsibility for DK, but Deft and Kellen, who were really superstars at the beginning of the year, definitely need to start stepping up and consistently winning that 2v2 lane. Canyon can do as much as he can to help assist that, but it's going to be really up to them in order to generate consistent early game leads, because this team really is solid in the mid to late game, but the early game has been a little bit of a question mark, and I think that definitely came up in the series, but for the most part, at least you were able to win. As for KDF on the other side, it's the same exact story that we've been telling over the past few weeks. It's a team that has been able to generate early leads because they have good hands, they have good mechanics, these players are talented. The problem is that once they get to the point in the game where they actually have to use these leads for something other than 1v1 or 2v2 lanes, they just don't know where to go with it. They're getting outskilled, and they're getting most especially out-macroed by good LCK teams, and unfortunately that just seems to be the fate of KDF right now. My dud of the series is going to go to Taiyun in the bot lane. His positioning is just poor. In lane, out of lane, he doesn't seem like he's really all that adept at playing at this level. I'm not saying that he's someone who could never play at this level and that he hasn't had moments where he's looked good, but for the most part, Taiyun and June have consistently been the worst bot lane in the LCK. I would say even lower than someone like Vital and Peter over on Nongshim. At times, even lower than Dekdom and Beryl. At least Dekdom has shown a proficiency to be able to team fight towards the back half of games, even when he's behind in gold. But Taiyun and June just don't really show any sort of strengths. Both of them have been maybe the two weakest players in their role in the LCK, and it's just been a little disappointing. I think if you had a little bit of a stronger bot lane, this team could actually contend for a bit, because I do like how the top side of this map is played. Dudu made some good plays in the series. He also made some really, really bad ones, especially in that game 2 on the Fiora, but sometimes you've got to take the good with the bad. And then Youngjae and Bulldog have had moments where they've looked really good as well. I thought Youngjae was actually really solid at being able to capitalize on mistakes and generate early leads for KDF in this series. It's just unfortunate that the rest of the team wasn't able to follow up. I think that we definitely are starting to understand where KDF stands. They're a really solid team with really solid hands, especially Youngjae in the jungle, who has really impressed me in 2023. But the rest of the team just doesn't really have it going, and the macro of them playing as a unit is definitely not up to snuff compared to the rest of the league. And so KDF is probably going to flounder around 8. It feels like the bottom 3 feel pretty locked in right now. KDF definitely feeling like they are a part of that, if not maybe the best part of it, at least because they're showing upside as opposed to teams like Nongshim and DRX, which just feel like they're floundering. But at the very least, they're able to compete with some of these teams in the early game, even if they're not able to take it home. As for DK, looking a lot better. You got to feel super good about their ability to come in and win this series 2-0, and to have a 2-0 week just in general, with Showmaker really popping off and being the player of the week for DK in general. He was awesome this week for this team, and they absolutely needed that. They needed him to step up in particular to show that this team could genuinely still be a contender. I dropped them after some poor last few weeks to number 5 in my power rankings. It is a very, very easy climb back up for them, so long as they keep winning and they keep playing like this. I know it wasn't the cleanest of early games, and it's not exactly the best team in the world that they were able to beat in this series, but at the end of the day, a win is a win, and they showed some things that they hadn't exactly showed throughout the season up till this point, so I'm going to take away a lot from this series in a positive manner for DK. Moving on now to day number 4 of week number 6 here. We've only got the second half of the week left here, and we kicked it off with the most esteemed rivalry in the LCK, the Telecom Wars between T1 and KT Rolster. And usually these are close. Usually I have some building that I can do, some oh, T1's looking really good. They look like the best team in the league, and KT was really surging in the past couple of weeks. But this was just a blowout. T1 just dominated them, and they looked like the better team by a lot, as they have against basically everybody that they've played against over the past few months. It just feels unfair to talk about T1 against anybody in the world right now. They really are that good. They've officially clinched the playoffs with this win, which is insane because we're only on week 6. So the fact that T1 has already clinched spring playoffs, they cannot get worse than 6th, is insane, even if they lost every other game. Good for T1, they look really, really good, but let's go ahead and talk about this series, I guess. T1 side, they were just awesome. They looked great both games really coming out on top. Obviously, 2 very easy to pilot, very successful comps. You go for the Lucian Nami in game number 1 with the secondary support coming out from the Annie in terms of damage. You still got the Annie in game 2, but this time you're pivoting to a Draven comp, which you really want to play through. But guess what? Let's say you get your Draven super far ahead, which they did. Let's say you hit the team fight phase later in the game, which they did. And let's say your Draven accidentally gets picked off by the rest of the team because they've got Gwen, Wukong, Gragas, and they might try to full dive the Draven in hopes that that will end the fight, which they did. Oops, you got Varus on the team, and that's your second AD carry. It doesn't actually matter. I think you can give player of the series to basically anybody on T1, but I'm going to give it to KT. I know this looks like a narrative award from me because KT has genuinely, been the narrative pick, I would say, for MVP for most people so far this year, but truthfully, if KT is not playing Varus in game 2, it actually becomes a little bit trickier because KT did a really good job shutting down the Draven in a lot of these teamfights. Guma was stepping a little too far forward, and KT was actually taking advantage of that. They were getting on him with the Gragas, with the Wukong, with the Nami. They were able to make sure this Draven actually had a hard time dealing a lot of damage towards the back half of these teamfights. Without KT on this Varus, it would have been a lot trickier. I'm not saying they wouldn't have won in the end because Faker's Annie is still there, and you still got Zeus on the Cassante, but you didn't even have to worry about any of that because KT was your secondary AD carry, and that's just a flexibility and a luxury that T1 has that no other team in the world has. Even other teams that play AD carries in the support position, they don't play him like KT does. He is just built different. The rest of the team around him is just simply built different, and that is showcased every single game. So yeah, KT to me is player of the series because I don't think it's nearly as easy of a win without him on the team. I think you have to give a lot of credit to Gumayushi, who did a really good job getting that Draven ahead in game number 2. I think you have to give a ton of credit to Owner in the jungle, who just continues to look like the best jungler in the LCK by such a large margin. It's super fun to watch. Faker gets 2 games of Annie, and he gets to be that secondary carry. Obviously, we know how broken Annie is on this patch, but Faker playing it makes it look even worse. And then Zeus in the top lane, kind of weak side, which is insane that the best top laner in the world gets to play weak side and your team is still ridiculously successful. That's just how crazy T1 is. They are on such a different level. I know I've already talked about them a ton in this weekend about how much stronger they are than basically everybody else that they play against, but it's worth reiterating because it's super true. I don't want to, talk you guys' ear off, but that's just the case for T1. As for KT Rolster, tough week, 0-2 week, not super atypical of KT. You would have obviously liked to have picked up a win in this week, but going up against Dplus KIA, going up against T1, these are tough teams. It's not like you were facing the easy teams this week. That was last week, and you actually did prove that you were able to take down those teams. And so for KT, I still feel okay. I still feel like they're solid. They're maybe not one of the best teams in the league, like we were maybe thinking through a couple of weeks there, but they're still an upper tier team, I would say. Maybe not top 3, but top 4, I think, is definitely still within possibility for KT. Not exactly a good series, I would say, especially in terms of performances. My dud of the series is going to go to Cuz again on KT Rolster. He had a really rough week. Obviously, I'm not the biggest fan of Cuz. I've certainly been a little bit lower on him than I think other analysts have been out there, especially what he was able to do last year, but I still think this is a little bit just of a bump in the road in 2023. This team has shown a decent amount of consistency, and they had a very, very tough week. So even though Cuz really, really struggled this week, going up against Canyon, having a really tough time actually being able to deal with him, going up against Owner, having a really tough time actually being able to deal with him. It's also maybe one of the hardest jungle schedules that you could possibly have in the entire league. You're going into maybe the best jungler in the world when he's at his best in Canyon. You're going into the jungler who's probably playing the best in the world right now in Owner. I'm willing to give Cuz a little bit of slack. He's still a fine jungler, at least in my eyes. Maybe not someone who is going to be on the level of some of those top tier junglers, but we don't really need him to be, and we don't really expect him to be. And so for KT Rolster, I hope that they can just take these losses in stride. Really, Cuz was the only one who felt like he was really getting outplayed like a lot. Everybody else was definitely worse than their counterpart. But I wouldn't say it was by such a large margin that I would be worried about this team's future, right? I still think that they're going to be really solid, even though BDD wasn't as good as Faker and certainly had some poor moments on that Gragas in Game 2, even though aiming was doing less damage than Keria towards the back half of Game number 2. Lehens was accomplishing nothing. Keen was losing in the 1v1 top lane to Zeus. Like, all of this stuff, while it doesn't look good on paper, relatively speaking, with context, is fine because you're going up against the best team and the best players in the world. And so I'm willing to cut KT a little bit of slack here. I'm not going to sit here and, roast them and sit here and tell you why they're not going to be good. I still think they're going to be solid. Obviously, this is a team that has struggled with consistency in the past, and hopefully they can bounce back and have a much better week next week after the 0-2. But if you were going to lose 0-2 in a week, losing to DK and T1, certainly not the two worst teams to lose to. As for T1 on the other side, I've talked about it at length at this point. This is the best team in the world, and it's really hard to argue otherwise for me now. They just seem to have everything going for them. Every player on the team is playing at an exceptionally high level. Every single, decision, draft decision, in-game macro decision that they make seems to just be better than everyone else. They're pulling out crazy shit in draft all the time, and it's absolutely working. It feels like they can just play anything and win, which is incredibly terrifying. They're creating their own meta that we've now seen a ton of other teams around the world try to adopt. It just feels like T1 is that team right now in the world that is setting everybody ahead at least a little bit more, and as long as they continue to play the way that they are and continue to innovate the way that they do, I imagine that that will probably be the case for at least the rest of spring, if not just the rest of the year. Moving on now to our second series of day number 4, and it's an okay one. A lot of times I say it's a good one or an interesting one. This one's just kind of, it's there, not particularly interesting, not particularly competitive. We saw Nongshim RedForce taking on Liiv SANDBOX, and SANDBOX picks up another win. Now, they do end up winning the series. However, they drop a game to Nongshim in game number 1, a relatively back-and-forth game that they certainly had opportunities to win, but Din just got too strong on the gangplank and was able to kind of take over that late game. You had Fiesta having a pretty good one, I would say, on the Annie. Sylvie with some really good engages on the Sejuani, and you're really just not able to hit a point in the game as Liiv SANDBOX where you're able to win those team fights. You're looking at Varus Caitlyn in the bot lane. They're probably going to get outscaled here by Ezreal Karma. They did. You're looking at Orianna, who should be able to team fight really well, but you're going into something like a gangplank. You're not going to be able to protect people from burst damage quite like that, especially if the GP has time to set up, and then, of course, the Jax needs time in a side lane to be able to split push, but with how much Nongshim was grouping, it was actually kind of difficult for SANDBOX to win that game. So we throw that out. Luckily, SANDBOX is able to come back and win the final 2 games of the series, mostly off the back of how good this jungle mid duo was, and they continue to be really, really good for SANDBOX, or I would say one of the more consistent ones in the league. I don't think they have the highest potential, as I've talked about, but I do think that they have nearly the highest consistency of any jungle mid duo in the LCK, obviously excluding T1, who is just kind of ridiculous, right? But SANDBOX continues their run of form here. My player of the series on that side is going to go to Willer in the jungle, and honestly, I know I talked about Owner potentially, just being the best jungler in the LCK, and honestly, I don't even think it's really all that crazy to say that. Him and Canyon are kind of fighting it out for that top spot. Peanut is right up there too, but you know who's in that conversation right now? It has to be Willer. He has been so good over the course of 2023. It makes it even more ridiculous, like unintelligible, that he was on the bench last year on a last place Hanwha Life team instead of on Fleek. Like, I don't understand what they were thinking. Obviously, him coming over here to SANDBOX has helped rejuvenate his career for the most part. Him and Closer seem to have a really good chemistry together. Willer's somebody who likes to be that team fight engager, whereas Closer definitely more of the carry-oriented mid laner, especially on those assassins. And so I think those two have really developed a nice chemistry together, and both, I think, have brought better versions of each other out. Willer's going to get my player of the series here, but Closer was also good. I think Willer was just a little bit more impactful in the early game, being able to set up a lot of the leads that Liiv SANDBOX ended up using in the mid to late game to be able to capitalize and end the games. But, you could give a lot of credit to Closer for actually capitalizing on it. The LeBlanc game in Game 2 was solid. That's probably Closer's signature champion, maybe outside of the Akali. Those are the two that obviously you associate the most with that mid laner, but LeBlanc definitely up there. Even if it's not particularly meta right now, it's still good to see Closer be able to pull it out and play it at a relatively good level. And then the Azir in Game 3, where he really was able to do a pretty ridiculous amount of damage. But big credit to Willer in the series. The Vi engages that he was able to pull off, especially in the early game of Game number 2, being able to set up his team for a lot of success and pressure in the early game. You're playing that Varus Caitlyn into Ezreal Karma again, and like I said, you really need to be able to generate that lead early. Luckily, they were able to do that in Game 2, mostly thanks to Willer, and then Game 3, you're playing the Wukong. This goes to Willer's strengths. I actually think Wukong is probably his best champion, this big teamfight engager that can support the team early. It gives him options in the early game to be able to spread the wealth, make sure that his laners can get ahead, but it also gives him a defined, clear role in the late game in a lot of these teamfights that they want to group for, so that he can really kind of show off his ability to play those late game teamfights and his ability to start a lot of these engages. And so overall, Willer's just been really, really solid this year. Definitely one of the best junglers in the LCK, and that's really, really good to see. Obviously, it's great to see young players really step it up, and I don't think there's a young player in the LCK who has stepped it up more this year than Willer. Already talked about Closer a bit, but he was kind of the big carry, I would say, for Liiv SANDBOX, especially in that Game 2 on the LeBlanc. A lot of damage coming out from LeBlanc. Like I always say with Closer, he's really good on these assassin mid laners. Things like the LeBlanc, things like the Akali, and when he doesn't go on that, he often goes to something like the Azir. Those are really the champions that he particularly likes to go to. I compare him a lot to players like Cream in the LPL, even someone like Zeka, also here in the LCK, I think has a very similar play style. I think Zeka's a little bit better at a top-end level, but it's not by like a ridiculous amount. I think we just saw a little bit of the problems that Closer has in Game number 1, where he got put on something like the Orianna, something that really does need to be a lot more supportive, not only in the early game, but in the late game. You're not going to be able to just carry by yourself with the damage. You're not going to be able to make these explosive plays in the mid game, and it just feels like Closer doesn't exactly have that playstyle locked down. He didn't win lane against Fiesta and the Annie, and it ended up honestly just not really being all that useful in the late game team fights, but at least he was able to kind of get back onto comfort, get back onto something he felt a lot more familiar with in Games 2 and 3. And honestly, I used to think it was a big negative to be, kind of this, player who really likes one play style. But I think for Closer in particular, and for a lot of players who play like him, you're not going to be able to ban out every relevant assassin in the game plus Azir. Like, you're just not going to be able to do that in basically any series. And so Closer's always going to have an opportunity to play the champions that he's good at. And if that's the case, then he really is one of the, I would say, I don't know if upper tier is the right way to put it, but one of the more interesting mid lane players in the LCK. Somewhere sitting around like the 4, 5, 6 range in terms of mid laners. He's really solid. Maybe not the top tier, but definitely someone who is really, really good and can carry your team to a playoff run, which is kind of what he's doing right now. Everybody else on the team was fine. Bertle had a good series. Envy and Kale were fine in the last 2 games. Overall, SANDBOX is good, but mostly running through this jungle mid. As for Nongshim, they are who we think they are. They are a team that has mechanics. They have talent. Din Din in particular actually showed off a lot of those mechanics in this series. I've been pretty critical of the top laner here for Nongshim, but for the most part, he was pretty solid in this series, and in my opinion, the best player. I think you could make the case that Vital and Peter have really stepped it up over the past few weeks. They were a little bit of a, I don't want to say a weak link, but kind of a neutral link over the first couple of weeks of the season. They've definitely been a lot stronger, in my opinion, especially in the early 2v2 laning phase in the past, like, week or so, which I think is a good sign, but really where I think this team has felt a lot of the drop-off from the early couple weeks of the season is the jungle mid duo here, and Sylvie and Fiesta just haven't really been all that good. Sylvie had some moments in Game 1, so did Fiesta, but Games 2 and 3, I mean, that's on the jungle mid duo just getting completely outplayed on the side of Nongshim. Fiesta's going to get another dud of the series here. He has been maybe the worst player in the LCK over the past 2 weeks, and it's just disappointing. I liked Fiesta a lot as a prospect. I really liked what I saw out of him in the LCK Challengers League last year, but it just seems to have not translated all that well to the LCK. He had some moments at the beginning of the split where it was like, oh, okay, he can really go toe-to-toe, especially in lane with a lot of the other LCK mid laners, but it just feels like a lot of that has disappeared after this team has lost basically all the confidence it had. They're now sitting at 1-11, which of course is not a very good record, but it really does feel like that's been taken out more on the jungle mid than basically anybody. If those two can get back on track, I do think Nongshim can be a team that at least pushes some of these top teams. I mean, they pushed them without them basically in the series winning game number 1, but I think you could get an even more competitive team if you do get that jungle mid back on track. This is a team that has the talent, I would say, to be somewhere around 8 or 9 in the standings instead of just like the consensus number 10, but right now they're just not living up to that talent. Din, Vital, they had okay series, but when Sylvie and Fiesta play like this, they're probably not going to be able to win. Overall, they're just not a very good team. In my opinion, they're the worst team in the LCK right now, even over DRX, although I think it's close. They just don't really have a lot of avenues to win. They are dwindling, I would say, mechanically early on in laning phase, and they've shown a very, very big problem with being able to close out games and their macro in the back half of games, and so I just don't think Nongshim is very good, which is unfortunate because I do like these players. But for SANDBOX on the other side, they're solid. It's not the most classy win in the entire world, definitely not the cleanest win. You would have liked to see them come out and just beat Nongshim and not struggle nearly as much as they did, but at least some of these players are looking good. Willer and Closer in particular, if they continue this hot streak that they're on in terms of how they're going to be able to play, this team should be an actual threat in the playoffs. It feels like top 6 is already relatively locked, and Liiv SANDBOX is definitely in that, but right now it's all about building up momentum so that by the time we get to that playoff series, you're either looking at a position where you're facing an opponent that you think you can beat, or you are really feeling hot and you're feeling good about how you want to play the game, so you might be able to cause an upset against a team that might be just a tad bit more talented than you. Either way, it's really good to see SANDBOX in this situation. It's something I wasn't predicting at the beginning of the year, and I think it's something a lot of SANDBOX fans are going to be happy about. That's going to bring us to our final day of action here in the LCK in week number 6. And we kicked off day number 5 with a banger of a series. Maybe not in terms of gameplay, but in terms of storytelling, absolutely. We had BRION taking on DRX. Two bottom teams. How could this have been one of the peak stories in the LCK this week? Well, let me tell you about Dekdom, the hero. And I understand, you're looking at the screen, you're like, he's not even player of the series. What are you talking about? Let me paint the scene, please. Pliata's playing. Game number 1 happens. Krako's playing. Bro wins. DRX suck. You know, they're bottom of the barrel. 1-10. They can't win a series. What are we doing? You know, none of these players are good. You know, Morgan pops off in the late game on the Fiora. The side lane pressure is just too much, and they're not really able to do anything. Well, then the cavalry comes in. Juhan enters the game for Krako. We saw this last week, and it really worked out to the favor of DRX. Even though they weren't able to win the series, they at least looked better. And Dekdom returns with a gigantic cast on his arm to play in this series, and they come back down 1-0, 1-10 in the standings to win the series 2-1 in 3 games. I mean, just an epic performance, even though it doesn't matter. Like, standings-wise, this win is completely irrelevant, but just from a narrative perspective, this is pretty freaking awesome, right? Player of the series is gonna go to Juhan for me. He was awesome in the jungle when he came in. Krako played game number 1 here on the Vi and just got completely out-jungled by Umti in terms of the pressure that he was able to put out on the map, and so Juhan comes back in. He looked a lot better than Krako did last week. Obviously, we can remember back to 2022, Juhan came in to try and save a struggling DRX team when Pioshik was just not playing all that well and was really driving them down the standings. He's doing the same thing here for them in 2023, obviously slightly different scenario. They're not mid-table, they're bottom table, so, but he comes in and he gets 2 games of Sejuani in, and he looks fantastic. He's able to control the pace of the game, he's able to control the jungle matchup, he has a ton of pressure on the map, his engages towards the back half when we get to team fights are super impactful. Juhan honestly just plays really well, and in my opinion, even though he was only in 2 games, definitely deserves Player of the Series. In fact, I think that definitely enhances his case because he got to play in the 2 games that they won in. Obviously, the other player that got to play in the 2 games that they won in, Dektum in the bot lane. I've talked about this all year long on this channel, but I'm so tired of Dektum slander. I've basically said this for, 2-3 years now? Even going back to the time on Nongshim, I was talking about this, where it feels like Dektum has never really been given any credit for how well he's been able to play over the past 3 years in the LCK. He didn't get credit on Nongshim. That team was, carried by jungle, and they had a really good support, as we've learned, and then he moves over to DK, and last year he's the weak link of Damwon, even though that's just not true, especially if you watch their games for the entirety of the year. And now he moves over to DRX, and it's like, he's the reason their team's 1-10, and it's like Barrel's running it, Fate's running it, Krako's running it, Rascal's running it, everybody is running it, maybe with the exception of Dektum in a lot of these games, but he re-enters here for Pliata, and he gets to play games 2 and 3 with a giant cast on his arm, and he looks really solid. He gets to play the Varus in game 2, the Ezreal in game number 3, that Ezreal being a particularly significant pick, I would say, for him, obviously behind the Aphelios, which I would consider Dektum's, bread and butter, but Ezreal also another champion he has had a ton of success on over the course of his career, but he looks really, really good in this series, and honestly, I hope this series alone puts to bed this narrative and this argument that Dektum is the weak link of DRX. He has not been the weak link of DRX at all this year. If anything, he has been the only member of this team that has played relatively okay in most of their series. I'm not saying he's been like a ridiculous strength, but to call him the weakness, I feel like is a gross, gross misunderstanding of the situation that DRX has run into. But one of the players who had played really bad at the past few series actually played really well here, and that's Fate in the mid lane. Fate had actually really struggled for this DRX team over the past few weeks. We talked about him earlier in the week, not playing particularly well, but really good game 2 and 3, especially game number 3 here on the Jace. He's really able to get ahead. Juhan does a good job enabling that mid lane position, and then he's able to just kind of spread the wealth on the map. He's able to take a lot of these fights and do a lot of damage. Now, credit to Karis, he matched in game number 3, definitely on that Akali. He also had an incredibly solid game, and that's the reason the game went super long, was Karis was super fed on the side of Bro. But at the end of the day, Juhan, Fate, Dektum, even Rascal on the Cassante, who I thought was fine, just a little bit too much, and DRX is able to win their 2nd series of the year. Really proud of this team and really proud of the substitute players. As for Bro on the other side, tough loss, man. You're no longer sitting there in a position where you're like, oh, we're definitely the best team out of playoffs. Record-wise, you definitely still are, comparing yourself to DRX, KDF, and Nongshim is definitely not the toughest competition to have to go into, but this team has really struggled over the past few weeks, and it feels like they kind of crashed back down to earth after a pretty strong start to the year, where players like Morgan and Umti were playing really well. Even Henna was playing really well towards the beginning part of the year. Not that all of them have been disastrous, but Bro has definitely had some problems, I would say, over the past few weeks. My dud of the series is going to go to Henna in the bot lane, who just got outplayed by Dektum when he came back in, which is pretty unacceptable considering Dektum had 1 arm. Henna had honestly been making some pretty solid progress, in my opinion, over the course of the beginning part of the year, but it just doesn't feel like it's been there in recent weeks. He's been okay, especially in the early laning phase, but his team fight ability, I think, has drastically decreased in the last few weeks, which is very disappointing to see out of an AD carry, because that's your role. That's what you're supposed to do. I get that laning 2v2 is really strong right now, but he just has not been able to translate any of those leads or any of those even just like neutral games into anything in the mid to late game, and that's just been very disappointing, and that I think is holding Bro back. Effort hasn't been good either. Not that he was awful in the series or anything, but definitely not particularly great, and Umti has been a huge weakness in the jungle, in my opinion. Those are the players that I think have really stood out for Bro to me is not playing well. Karis, on the flip side, has actually played really well in the mid lane, even in their losses. He's had some series where he's not looked great, but I think for the most part, he's actually been relatively consistent as a mid laner. If he was on a better team, I honestly think that Karis would be viewed in a very similar light to a player, maybe like Closer. Not that he's as good, but I think it's not super far off to make the comparison that they could be in a very similar range if given similar talent around them. But Karis has no talent with him on this Bro team, and so he's going to continue to struggle. Bro just doesn't look very good right now. They were a team that looked like they could be competitive against some of the top 6 teams. Now, it feels like more than ever there is a strong divide in between the top 6 and the bottom 4, and Bro, instead of it being the bottom 3, Bro has very quickly made it a bottom 4 and has joined the rest of the teams at the bottom of the standings. But for DRX, big win for them here, if not just for some confidence in the season, in the split. Having Juhan come in and play as well as he does, you just have to give him the opportunity now. I don't really know what else to say. I like Krako as a player. I was super high on him going into the year, but Juhan has just simply been better for this team than anything that Krako has been able to give you over the course of the year so far. So I would expect to see more Juhan, or at least I would hope to see more Juhan. Obviously, hopefully Dektum can heal and get back, you know, relatively soon. If I'm him, I'm just taking a break. I mean, I understand that you want to go out there and you want your team to win, but you're not really playing for anything right now. Like, this team is not going to be making playoffs, even if everything goes right. And so I would probably just take the rest of, you know, however long you need off. I would not be playing with a cast on stage, certainly not. But, you know, credit to Dektum. It's a hero's performance. Hopefully this team can start to get a little bit of momentum on their side, because this series was honestly pretty cool to watch from a narrative perspective, and I think a lot of us are cheering for a DRX turnaround. And that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in week 6 of the LCK. And it's a good one. It's definitely one that I'm excited to talk about. A little bit of a blowout, but that's not always a bad thing. We had the Kwangdong Freecs taking on Hanwha Liiv Esports. And HLE looking really strong and really good in this series. And honestly, that is such a good sign to see. Now, I know that HLE has had a little bit of an easy schedule ever since their brutal start to the year, where they really just couldn't get a lot of things going, but you know, say what you want about easy schedule, there aren't really easy games in the LCK, right? People are going to push you, and for you to be able to just come out and just win, like, super cleanly, look really good doing it, that is a good sign against anybody in the LCK, and that's what Hanwha Liiv has been able to do over the past few weeks. They've looked so much better. What are they, 7-1 in their last 8 series? That's really good. That's about as good as you can get in the LCK. Again, I know they haven't faced the toughest of competition over that 8-series stretch, but to go 7-1 across 8 series in the LCK is hard. It's not easy to do, so for Hanwha Liiv to be able to do it and look so good doing it, I think is a really good sign. My player of the series on the side of Hanwha, this was a no-brainer in this series, but it's gonna go to Klid. I know Klid had a horrible start to the year, and he was really looked at as the scapegoat, as the big negative influence on Hanwha, the one that was letting the team down when they started, well, like 1-3 in their first couple of series, but ever since then, Klid has honestly been really, really good. One of the best players on Hanwha Liiv, one of the more consistent junglers in the league during this win streak, and that absolutely continued in this series. Not only was the Nidalee game in game number 1 really good, he plays these early game aggressive champions at a really high level. I think of the Elise, I think of the Lee Sin. Obviously, they can play really well, but this Vi game in game 2 was perfect. I mean, there was literally nothing else I could have asked for him to do in this Vi game in game 2. He was everything that you want out of your jungler and then some. This is genuinely one of the best jungle performances of the year from anyone in pro play. The Klid really did play it that well. And, you know, we'll talk about Gen.G. He didn't really have a lot of pressure in this series, but Klid played awesome, and he deserves all the credit and recognition that he's going to get for really rebuilding his image and bouncing back. I talked about this a little bit earlier on in the year, but it's really tough to kind of get yourself into that mental space of, wow, I've been really bad, I just have to forget about it. That switch just has to flip, right? I just have to get back to being the best version of me. Making that mental switch and not getting tilted, not, you know, getting yourself into bad habits, not getting down on yourself, that's tough to do. Klid made that adjustment, and he made it really well, so I want to give him a lot of credit for that. For, you know, as bad of a reputation as I think Klid is going to have after the way this year kind of started, and of course how everything ended on FPX, I really do think he's been a big positive force for Hanwha, and a big reason why this team has gone 7-1 in their last 8 series. But you also got to shout out the players who have really stepped up, and I talked about them early in the week. Zeka in the mid lane has been really, really good for this team. He continues to be a major positive influence, just like he was for DRX last year when no one was paying attention. Now he's, again, probably the most consistent player on Hanwha, at least over the course of the year. He was really solid in the series. Viper and Life have definitely figured it out in terms of what they've been able to do in the early 2v2. The Caitlyn Lux was something that just would not work for Hanwha Life earlier on in the year. To see them be able to pull it out and genuinely be able to generate strong leads, I know it's against the weakest bot lane in the LCK, we will get to that, but to see them be able to do it at all is honestly a really good sign, and Kingen has also been a rock up on the top side. Everybody on Hanwha is playing really well right now, but big shout out to Klid, because I really do think he was spectacular in this series. And then for KDF on the other side, they're just not very good, right? Like, the bottom teams aren't very good. DRX kind of had their big moment in the sun this week. I'm not exactly sure what that means overall for the bottom of the standings, but for KDF, it's just another series where they look completely and utterly outclassed, and really, that's become a relevant theme for this team. My dud of the series is going to go to Dudu in the top lane. He's had some really good games this split. He's also had some really bad games this split. Both games in this series were really bad, I would say, for Dudu. That game 2 in particular, he just got run over. He was out of position a lot. He had damage on the Jace. He was able to go out and do stuff, but he would often just be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It feels like the macro sense of what Dudu's been able to do over the course of the year has just diminished so much. It feels like he is tilted, and he's trying to force a lot of plays around the map, and that's just not a strategy for success, especially against a team that is clicking like Hanwha Life is right now. I don't think he's the only player on this team to play bad, but I think in this series, it was pretty clear that he was the worst player on the team. The other player that I really want to shout out, and people aren't going to like this, is Bulldog. I think Bulldog has been bad over the past few games, and that's not really all that debatable to me. I know we're all holding out hope that Bulldog is going to be this big prospect, and people really liked him in the Challengers League, but he just has not been able to hold up against LCK mids so far, and, you know, I talked about this. I didn't have him nearly as high as a lot of other analysts going into the year. I didn't think the tape was that extraordinary. I thought it was fine, but when you're comparing it to, like, 2020 Karis, when he got his, you know, big breakout season in the Challengers League on Gen.G, I just didn't think that Bulldog was on the same level as some of these top mid lane prospects that have been coming through the system the past few years, and I don't want to say I've been right, because he certainly had moments where he's looked good, but the consistency is just not there. I understand that, you know, being on a bad team can make you look a lot worse, and I don't want to call Bulldog like a failure of a prospect or anything. He's like 17 years old, so he's certainly not done growing or anything like that, but to make the statement that Bulldog is there right now, I think is a mistake. I just don't think he is, you know, a very good LCK mid laner right now at 17 years old. Do I think he could get there? Definitely. I mean, for someone who is 17, he really has grown a lot and shown a lot of potential at this level, but it just doesn't feel like it's there right now. I know I'm going to piss some people off by saying that. I've got a lot of really passionate Bulldog fans, not only in my comment section, but I see them all over the internet. I'm just a little bit lower on him as a player and what he's able to offer right now in 2023 as a starter, because that's really what matters at the moment. Can he grow into something more? Yes, but he's just not, he's not there right now. He just isn't. He has not been very good over the past few series, and this series is definitely included. Youngjae got run over in the jungle matchup. Taiyun and June are probably the worst bot lane in the LCK, so it's not exactly like he's surrounded with a ton of talent, but KDF is really struggling. Like, this team that was looking competitive against some other teams earlier on in the year, they're just not anymore. They're not competitive. They're not able to hang tough. I know Hanwha Life's kind of been on a roll, but this was a demolition. Game number 1 was a little boring, but Hanwha held control, especially through the Nidalee and the Azir, and then game 2 was a slaughter from the Vi, and so not a lot of good to take away for KDF. A pretty bad series from them, genuinely one of the worst of the year. And then for Hanwha, just keep rolling, man. You're 7-1 in your last 8, but the schedule is going to start getting harder from this point onwards. You're really going to start getting tested. This team has been sitting 6th in my power rankings for quite a long time, despite the fact that they're on a pretty massive win streak. If that can continue, if you can keep this rolling over the next few weeks against, you know, Liiv SANDBOX or KT Rolster or some teams kind of in that, you know, department, this could theoretically be like a top 3 team in the LCK. They really are that good. Just right now, I don't know if I have the confidence to say that they're absolutely going to get there, but at least on paper, they should be able to get there, and they really are playing hot right now, so hopefully they can keep it up. Alright, that is going to do it for my LCK Week 6 overview and analysis of all 5 days, all 10 series on the docket. If you guys enjoyed the video, let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, up on your screen right now, you're going to see the updated LCK standings after Week 6. Any ties will be broken alphabetically. We're no longer in the tie era. I don't know why I keep saying that. I have to say it for all the other videos, but we're way past the tie era when it comes to the LCK. In the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. In the second column to the right, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. So let's go over the risers and the fallers. The biggest riser this week, Dplus KIA, jumping up to number 3, or jumping back to number 3. It is pretty clear that they at least deserve to be in that top 3 space. Them being able to win over KT was really solid, and them just feeling like they're getting their confidence back. It's just a really good look for a DK team that I was just waiting for them to look good, you know, at some point this year. It seems they finally were able to do that here in week number 6. So they jump up to number 3. That means KT falls to number 4. 0-2 week, but I'm not super concerned about them. They just fall because I needed to move Dplus up. And then SANDBOX moves down to number 5. I still think they're a solid team, but I think when we start getting to the nitty-gritty, it doesn't seem like they're going to be able to hang with maybe the best teams in the league. They're just a really solid one that's going to be consistent against teams that are struggling, which means they're in the top 5, which is still pretty freaking good in the LCK. Other movers, I have DRX leapfrogging KDF this week. KDF has just not impressed me over the past few weeks. I think their bot lane is a problem. I think their top lane has been a problem. I think jungle mid isn't exactly as strong as people like to say it is, so they fall into bottom 2 for me. DRX with that win jumps up to number 8. They could be jumping up to number 7 if things go right with Juhan over the next few weeks. Him coming in really does feel like it's going to, I don't know, revitalize a lot of the momentum surrounding that team. Hopefully I'm right. I'm kind of planting my flag in the idea that DRX is going to at least finish off this split strong and maybe go into summer with a little bit more confidence, but, you know, we're going to have to kind of wait and see as that approaches, but those are the power ranking changes. Let's go ahead and talk about my player of the week and my dud of the week here in week 6. My player of the week is going to go to Showmaker on Dplus KIA. He was awesome this week. He's honestly kind of struggled in 2023 so far, but this was easily his best week of the year, and it really felt like a nice bounce back. Everything I wanted to see, him dominating lane, him dominating out of lane, him having good macro sense, him playing aggressive. It was everything you wanted to see out of Showmaker to prove that he still is one of the best mid laners in the entire world. He absolutely proved that to me this week, and it was really, really good to see for Dplus KIA. My dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to go to Fiesta on Nongshim. It just feels like Fiesta has downgraded so much in the past few weeks. I already said this in one of the Nongshim reviews, but honestly, he's been one of the worst players in the LCK over the past, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks, if not the single worst player in the LCK. He's been a huge problem for Nongshim. He has not been able to win laning phases. He's given his opponents so much gold, and he never really knows when to not try and take an aggressive trade. It's really been a problem, and I like Fiesta as a player, but he's got to clean up the mistakes, and he's got to clean up the weaknesses before I feel super confident about calling him an LCK caliber mid laner, which he's just not playing like right now. So Fiesta is going to get my dud of the week for week 6, and Showmaker is going to get my player of the week for week 6, but that's going to do it. I hope you guys enjoyed. Like I said earlier, if you did, let me know down in the comment section below. What do you think of my power rankings? Who is too high? Who is too low? What player is your player of the week? What player is your dud of the week? I love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback down in the comments. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button. Not only does it show me that you guys are enjoying the content, but of course it helps get this video out to more people. We put a lot of time and effort into these weekly reviews, so if you're enjoying them, it would really mean a lot to me if you hit that like button. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We cover all 4 major regions on this channel, as well as the NACL, not just the LCK, and so if you're interested in like a one-stop shop channel for all LoL esports news, overviews, everything like that, this is the place for it. Hit that subscribe button. It would really mean a lot to me. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.